May 14, 1943. The North Atlantic. U-266, a Type 7 sea submarine commanded by Oberleutnant Zurzay Rolf von Jessen, dove at 11:43 hours after a British Liberator appeared on the horizon. The crew had done everything right. The lookouts had seen the aircraft first. The dive was clean. The boat reached 80 meters in under a minute. The depth charges found them anyway. U-266 was reported overdue on May 20th. No survivors. Von Jessen was 24 years old. He was not unusual. He was not unlucky in any way that separated him from the 50 other U-boat commanders who died in May of 1943 alone. What made von Jessen's death part of something larger, something that Berlin understood and refused to name, was this. His crew had been trained for 14 weeks. The crew that sailed U-266 on its first patrol in 1941 had trained for 32. Hold that detail, it will come back. The standard history of the Battle of the Atlantic ends in May 1943 with a technology story, and the technology story is true. The Allies had developed centimetric radar that U-boats could not detect. They had closed the Atlantic air gap with very long-range Liberator aircraft. They had broken the German naval Enigma cipher, designate Triton, allowing convoy routing around Wolfpack patrol lines. They had developed the Hedgehog, a head-throwing mortar, which attacks submarines without losing sonar contact the way conventional depth charges did. Each of these developments contributed to what the Germans called Schwarze Mai, Black May, the month in which 41 submarines were lost. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, and after January 1943 commander of the entire German Navy, withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes on May 24, 1943. He called it a tactical pause. He called it regrouping. He told his commanders that new equipment was coming: radar detectors, acoustic torpedoes, heavier anti-aircraft guns, and that the campaign would resume when the balance had shifted. What he did not say in any communication to his commanders, to the German Naval High Command, or to Hitler was what his own war diary showed he already knew. The balance would not shift, not in any way that mattered. Here is what you need to understand about what Dönitz knew in the summer of 1943 and why that knowledge is the hidden center of this story. The Allied technological solutions were real and they were serious, and they could, in theory, be answered. Radar detectors could be improved. Aircraft could be engaged with flak rather than avoided. Convoy cipher intelligence could be compensated for with new patrol patterns. These were engineering problems, and German engineering had solved harder ones. But underneath, the technology problem was a different kind of problem entirely, one that could not be solved with a better antenna or a new torpedo. A problem that had been growing quietly since 1942, and that Black Mace had pushed past the point of recovery. The problem was not what the Allies were doing to German submarines. The problem was what the Atlantic was doing to the men inside them, and what losing those men was doing to every crew that came after. The U-boat arm was consuming itself, and the machine it was consuming first was not steel, it was knowledge. In September of 1939, when the war began, the German U-boat force had 57 operational submarines and roughly 3,000 trained crewmen. The training pipeline that produced those men ran between 18 months and 2 years per crew. It included classroom instruction at the U-boat school in Pillau, torpedo attack training in the Baltic, extended simulated patrols, and finally a working up period aboard an operational boat under an experienced commander before the trainee crew was considered ready for independent patrol. The result was a force of exceptional quality. The commanders who sailed in the first years of the war, Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, Joachim Schepke, were the product of a training system that had spent years producing men who understood not just how to operate a submarine, but how to think inside one. How to read a convoy's zigzag pattern, how to calculate a firing solution in darkness under a destroyer's propeller noise, how to hold a crew together at 200 meters with the hull groaning and the lights gone and the air going bad. That knowledge was not written in any manual. It lived in the men. Between 1939 and the end of 1941, the U-boat arms sank 7.5 million tons of Allied shipping. The commanders who did most of that sinking became legends inside the Kriegsmarine. The aces, the tonnage kings, the men whose patrol reports Dönitz read personally and annotated in his own hand. Kretschmer alone sank 44 ships totaling 266,629 tons before he was captured in March 1941. Prien, the Bull of Scapa Flow, sank 28 ships before U-47 was lost with all hands in the same month. Remember those names. Remember what they represented, not the tonnage, the knowledge. The Allied countermeasures that developed across 1942 and into 1943 did not just sink submarines. They sank the men inside them in a specific and irreplaceable order. The most experienced crews died first because the most experienced crews were the ones conducting the most aggressive patrols, pressing attacks in defended convoys, staying on the surface to pursue targets when doctrine said to dive. Kretschmer's style of warfare at a close-range night service attacks inside the convoy columns was the style that had produced his tonnage figures and the style that the improving Allied defenses punished most severely. By the end of 1942, most of the first-generation commanders were gone, dead, captured, or worn to the edge of collapse and rotated ashore. The men replacing them were younger, less experienced, and trained on a schedule that had already begun to compress under the pressure of losses. Here is where the replacement death spiral begins, and here is why it matters more than any radar frequency or cipher breakthrough. When an experienced crew was lost, the U-boat arm needed a replacement crew. That replacement crew came from the training pipeline. But the training pipeline operated at a fixed capacity, a fixed number of instructors, training vessels, and months available before the operational fleet's needs demanded the crew be declared ready and sent to sea. When losses were low, the pipeline had time. When losses accelerated, the pipeline was squeezed. Dönitz's own BDU war diary entries from late 1942 show him noting the compression explicitly. Training cycles that had run 30 weeks were running 22, then 18. Then by the middle of 1943, 14. The crews being sent to the North Atlantic in the summer of 1943 had spent less than half the time at sea before their first combat patrol that the crews of 1939 and 1940 had spent in training alone. This is the detail to hold. Because what it means in practice is not abstract. It means a 22-year-old commander who has never heard a destroyer's sonar ping against his hull being asked to make the same decisions under the same pressure that Kretschmer had made after years of patrol experience. It means a chief engineer who has practiced the emergency dive procedure 40 times being sent to a boat, where the experienced engineers had practiced it 400. It means a crew that has rehearsed depth charge survival in training simulations being asked to survive the real thing without the layer of instinct that only repetition builds. The less trained crews died faster. The faster they died, the more the pipeline compressed. The more the pipeline compressed, the less trained the next crews were. The mathematics were self-defeating and they accelerated. If this story is showing you something about the war you haven't seen before, a like helps it reach people who care about this history. Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke understood exactly what he was looking at. Henke commanded U-515, a Type 9 sea submarine. and was one of the most effective U-boat commanders of the Middle War period. Careful, calculating, technically precise in a way that the aces of the early war had not needed to be, because the early war had not demanded it. He survived longer than most of his generation because he had adapted his tactics to the new Allied capabilities faster than the men around him. He used radar detection equipment before it was standard issue. He trained his crew on crash dive procedures until the response was automatic rather than deliberate. He was the type of commander the U-boat arm could not afford to lose and could not afford to keep ashore. In October 1943, Henke wrote a patrol report that Dönitz read and marked. Henke had observed 2 other U-boats lost in his patrol area in conditions that his analysis suggested should not have been fatal to an experienced crew. The Allied aircraft had given adequate warning time. The dive should have been sufficient. He noted, with the flat precision of a man who had learned not to say what he meant too directly in official documents, that the crews of both boats had completed training within the previous 4 months. He did not write that they had died because they were not ready. He did not need to. Dönitz understood the report. He marked it, filed it, and sent 3 more boats to the same patrol area the following week. Hold that moment. The new equipment Dönitz had promised his commanders arrived through 1943 and into 1944, and it was real. The Zonenkönig acoustic torpedo, designated T5 by the Germans and GNAT by the Allies, could home on a destroyer's propeller noise and had genuine tactical effect. On its first deployment in September 1943, Wolfpack Leuthen sank 3 escorts and damaged a 4th from a single convoy. The Naxos radar detector gave boats some ability to detect Allied centimetric radar transmissions. The Schnorchel, a retractable air mast that allowed submarines to run their diesels while submerged, promised to reduce the time boats spent on the surface, and therefore their exposure to air attack. Each of these solutions addressed a real problem. None of them addressed the actual problem. Because the acoustic torpedo could be defeated by a towed noisemaker, the Allies called it Boxers, which was deployed within weeks of the first GNAT attacks, because the Naxos detector had a detection range shorter than the radar it was meant to warn against, giving crews seconds rather than minutes. Because the Schnorchel, which allowed submerged running, also reduced a submarine speed to roughly 5 knots, making it nearly impossible to intercept a convoy and almost entirely eliminating the tactical mobility that had made the Wolfpack concept effective in the first place. The equipment was not solving the battle. It was changing what the battle looked like while the same mathematics continued underneath. Between June 1943 and the end of the war in May 1945, Germany commissioned 435 new U-boats. In the same period, 435 submarines were lost, a replacement rate that balanced exactly at 0 gain. The Atlantic was not being won or lost in those months. It was simply consuming submarines at the same rate the shipyards were producing them, and consuming the men inside them at a rate the training pipeline could not match. The second-generation commanders at the IT, the men like Henke, who had adapted and survived into 1943 and 1944, began to understand the shape of what they were inside. Not a campaign with a trajectory, a system that was maintaining its own destruction. Henke himself was captured in April 1944 when U-515 was sunk by American aircraft and destroyers working together. Exactly the combined air-sea team that the new equipment had failed to defeat. He was taken to a prisoner of war facility in the United States. On June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day, he was shot and killed by guards while allegedly attempting to escape. He was 34 years old. Whether he was attempting to escape or something else in that moment, in the darkness outside the wire, is a question the record does not answer cleanly. What Dönitz knew What the BDU war diaries, declassified after the war, show he knew with statistical clarity was that the U-boat campaign had passed its break-even point sometime in the spring of 1943 and had not returned to it since. The boats were not sinking enough Allied tonnage to affect the flow of men and material to Britain. The convoys were arriving. The buildup for what would become the Normandy invasion was proceeding on schedule. The Atlantic lifeline, which the submarine campaign had been designed to sever, was intact and strengthening. He continued the campaign. The argument he made to himself in the diaries and in his post-war memoir was that stopping was not an option, that a U-boat force that withdrew from the Atlantic would free Allied anti-submarine resources to be redeployed against Germany in other theaters, that even an ineffective campaign imposed a cost on the... These arguments were not irrational. They were the arguments a commander makes when the only alternatives to continuing are defeat or surrender, and neither has yet been authorized. Dönitz was operating inside a system, Hitler's Germany, that had no mechanism for choosing to lose gracefully. Stopping meant admitting the campaign had failed. And in the Germany of 1943 and 1944, that admission had consequences that Dönitz understood better than most. So the boats sailed. 14-week crews against opponents their predecessors with 32 weeks of training had not been able to defeat. Boys who had never heard a real depth charge being sent to water, where veteran crews had already died. Think about what it was like to be a crew member sailing out of Lorient or Brest or La Pallice in the autumn of 1943. To know the loss rates they knew. The U-boat arm did not hide its casualties from its own men with any great success. When a boat failed to return, the men on the dock who had watched it leave knew what the silence meant. The survival mathematics were not secret inside the force. The expected operational life of a U-boat in the North Atlantic by mid-1943 was less than 2 patrols. Less than 2 patrols for men who had trained for 14 weeks. And yet they sailed. Not because they did not understand, because understanding and stopping were not the same thing for men inside a military structure that had no language for refusal. The last U-boat loss of the war occurred on May 7, 1945, the day before Germany's unconditional surrender took effect. U-320 was sunk by a British aircraft off the Norwegian coast. Her commander was Oberleutnant zur See Heinz Emmerich. He was 23 years old. The war had 1 day remaining. U-320's crew had been at sea for 11 days. Of the 40,000 men who served in German U-boats across the war, 28,000 did not return. That 70% fatality rate is the highest sustained loss ratio of any branch of any armed service in any nation across the entire conflict. It exceeds the losses of Soviet penal battalions. It exceeds the casualty rates of Japanese kamikaze units. It exceeds anything the war produced in any other theater or any other uniform. And the men who composed the majority of that figure, the men who died in the last 2 years of the campaign, were not the veterans. The veterans were mostly already gone. The men who died in 1944 and into 1945 were the 14-week crews. The boys who had replaced the boys who had replaced the men who had built the force from nothing in 1939. The Allied technology had not killed the U-boat campaign. It had revealed the campaign's true shape. A structure that could only function when manned by men with knowledge the training pipeline could no longer produce. When that knowledge was gone, the campaign continued on momentum alone, sustained by a command philosophy that had confused duty with arithmetic and called the confusion honor. The replacement death spiral is not a concept that appears in any German naval document by that name. It was not a thing Dönitz or his staff ever articulated as a single mechanism. What the BDU war diaries show instead is a series of individual decisions: compress training, By 2 weeks, compress it by 4 more, declare these crews ready. Send them, each of which was defensible in isolation and catastrophic in aggregate. This is the deeper truth the U-boat war contains. Not that Germany was outproduced, though it was. Not that the Allies broke Enigma, though they did. Not that centimetric radar closed a tactical window, though it did. The deeper truth is that a force can be destroyed from the inside out, through the systematic consumption of the knowledge that made it function, without any single decision being the cause, and without any single commander being able to see the whole shape of what is happening until it is past the point where seeing it changes anything. Dönitz saw it. He marked Werner Henke's patrol report in October 1943 and sent 3 more boats to the same area the following week. He understood what the mathematics said and chose to read them as a reason to continue rather than a reason to stop. That choice cost 28,000 men their lives. Most of them young, most of them undertrained, most of them sailing into water where better men had already died, because the machine that should have prepared them had been consumed by the same campaign it was trying to sustain. Karl Dönitz survived the war. He was named Hitler's successor in the Führer's final political testament and served as head of the German state for exactly 23 days before surrendering to the Allies on May 23, 1945. At the Nuremberg trials, he was convicted of war crimes and crimes against international law relating to unrestricted submarine warfare. He was sentenced to 10 years in Spandau prison. He served every day of it. He was released in 1956, wrote his memoirs, and spent the rest of his life arguing that the U-boat campaign had been a strategic necessity and that his commanders and crews had served with honor. He was not wrong about the honor. He was not right about the necessity. He died in 1980 at the age of 89, the last surviving commander-in-chief of any of the major belligerent nations of the Second World War. He outlived most of the men he sent to sea by 4 decades. Ralph von Jessen, the 24-year-old commander of U-266 who dove correctly and died anyway on May 14, 1943, has no grave. The North Atlantic has no floor shallow enough to mark. His name appears on the Naval Memorial at Lebow, on the Baltic coast of Germany, where the names of 34,000 German sailors with no known grave are cut into stone. The memorial stands 85 meters tall. On clear days, you can see it from the water. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it reached you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters and helps it find the people who care about getting the details right. If you're not subscribed, I'd be glad to have you here. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your country in the comments. And if someone in your family served in the war, a grandfather, a father, an uncle, tell us about them. These men deserve to be remembered.